Throughout the Bible, there are numerous stories that are often celebrated for their lessons of faith, redemption, and divine intervention. Woven within these narratives are accounts that raise difficult questions about morality, justice, and human suffering. These stories, sometimes glossed over or left unexplored, reveal the complexities of biblical texts, where divine actions and human choices can appear harsh, controversial, and at times contradictory to the broader messages of love, compassion, and justice found in the Bible. In this series, we explore three of the most challenging and unsettling stories in the Bible. Each of these narratives presents a deep tension between what we expect from a loving and just God and the harsh realities faced by the characters involved. From the exploitation of an Egyptian servant to the violation of a royal daughter, these stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions. Why does God seem silent in the face of cruelty? Where is justice when the innocent are mistreated or abandoned? By examining these difficult accounts, we aim to shed light on the often overlooked aspects of Scripture. Welcome to part 1 of our series, The Most Disturbing Stories of the Bible. Tamar's rape by her half-brother Amnon is one of the most disturbing and tragic stories in the Bible, found in 2 Samuel 13. Amnon, the eldest son of King David, becomes infatuated with his half-sister Tamar, the full sister of Absalom. Tamar is described as a beautiful and virtuous woman. Amnon, obsessed with his desire for Tamar, pretends to be ill and deceives his father David into sending Tamar to care for him. Following the advice of his cousin Jonadab, Amnon orchestrates a scenario where Tamar is left alone with him in his room. Despite Tamar's protests and her appeal to his sense of morality, Amnon violates her, ignoring her pleas and the cultural and moral boundaries that should have protected her. After the violation, Amnon's infatuation turns to hatred. He immediately rejects and shames Tamar, throwing her out of his house. Tamar, now devastated and dishonored, tears her garments and mourns publicly but receives little justice. She goes to live in her brother Absalom's house, where she is left to suffer. In silence, King David hears of the incident but does not take action, despite his anger. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, waits 2 years before exacting revenge on Amnon, ultimately killing him during a feast. This act of revenge sets off a series of tragic events, including Absalom's rebellion against David. After violating Tamar, Amnon's sudden shift from desire to hatred is disturbing. This act illustrates how women in the ancient world were often viewed as disposable once they were no longer pure in the eyes of society. King David's failure to act upon hearing about the violation of his daughter is particularly troubling. Although he is described as being furious, David does nothing to punish Amnon or seek justice for Tamar. His inaction may stem from guilt, given his own moral failings, for example, his adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. But his silence contributes to Tamar's continued suffering. Tamar's fate after the violation is one of lifelong trauma. She is not given justice or a voice. Instead, she is forced to live out her life in Absalom's household in silence and sorrow, effectively erased from the narrative. Her grief and public mourning, marked by the tearing of her garments, symbolize the complete destruction of her identity and future prospects. While Absalom eventually kills Amnon as revenge for Tamar, his action leads to further violence and chaos, including his eventual rebellion against David. The cycle of vengeance rather than justice escalates the tragedy. The story of Tamar's violation stands in stark contrast to many of the core themes that are celebrated in other parts of the Bible, particularly the teachings of Jesus on love, forgiveness, and justice. One of the most glaring contradictions in this story is the absence of justice for Tamar. Despite being a victim of a horrific crime, she receives no comfort support or resolution. The Bible elsewhere champions justice, Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression. But Tamar is left to live in disgrace. While King David is described as being angry upon hearing about Tamar's violation, he does nothing to address it. His lack of intervention is not only morally questionable, but also puzzling considering David's responsibility as a king and father. Even more troubling is that God remains silent throughout the story. Given that the Bible often portrays God as a champion of the oppressed, Psalm 82:3, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and oppressed. His inaction in this case is particularly disturbing. While Amnon is ultimately killed by Absalom, his punishment comes only after 2 years. and it is driven by personal vengeance rather than by legal justice. This lack of immediate divine or kingly punishment for his actions contradicts the message in the Bible that sin will be met with consequences. Romans 6:23. For the wages of sin is death. Yet Amnon faces little retribution until it's too late. Throughout the Bible, there are calls to protect and honor women. Ephesians 5:25-28. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Yet Tamar is treated as little more than a disposable object in this narrative. Her voice is silenced, and her worth is seen only through the lens of her violated body. The inaction by David and the silence of God pose significant moral and ethical challenges. Why was there no intervention to prevent the violation? No justice was given to Tamar after the fact. The story presents a cycle of violence and vengeance rather than forgiveness or reconciliation. Absalom's murder of Amnon may seem justifiable as a form of revenge, but it leads to further bloodshed and instability. This stands in contrast to Jesus' teachings on forgiveness, Matthew 5:38-39. Do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. The story challenges what many people expect from God. A protector of the vulnerable, God's lack of intervention raises theological questions about his nature and justice. If God is omnipotent and loving, why does he allow such cruelty and suffering without offering relief or retribution? Scholars often focus on the gender dynamics of this story, examining how Tamar's treatment reflects broader patriarchal values of the time. Feminist theologians argue that Tamar's silencing represents how women's voices were marginalized and ignored in biblical narratives. Other scholars point to David's inaction as part of the larger moral decline within his family following his own sins with Bathsheba. Some theologians attempt to reconcile the story by framing it as a reflection of human sinfulness and the consequences of moral failings. However, this explanation often fails to address the lack of justice for Tamar or the moral contradictions presented by God's inaction. The story of Tamar's violation raises significant concerns about the cruelty and hypocrisy of divine justice in the Bible. God's lack of intervention, combined with David's failure to act, leads to deep moral contradictions. While the Bible elsewhere champions justice, protection of the vulnerable, and love, Tamar is denied all of these. Her suffering is compounded by the silence of both God and her family, making this story a clear example of the disparity between God's proclaimed nature and his actions in specific biblical narratives. Jesus' teachings about love, forgiveness, and justice seem wholly absent in this story. The failure to address Tamar's trauma or punish her assailant reflects a troubling inconsistency within the Bible that calls into question the nature of divine morality. This story challenges the notion of a loving, protective God and forces us to confront the possibility of divine cruelty, or at the very least indifference to the suffering of the innocent. What do you think about this? Share your thoughts with me in the comments before we move on to the next story. The Book of Job is one of the most perplexing and controversial books in the Bible. It deals with profound themes such as suffering, divine justice, and human faith, raising challenging questions about God's role in human suffering. The story begins with a description of Job, a righteous man living in Uz, who is described as blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. Job chapter 1, verse 1. Job is blessed with wealth, a large family, and good health, but not for long. The disturbing aspects of Job's story start early on. In the opening chapters, Satan, or the adversary, appears before God in heaven. God points out Job's righteousness and faithfulness, but Satan challenges God, suggesting that Job is only loyal because of the blessings he has received. Satan proposes that if Job's wealth, family, and health were taken away, Job would curse God. Surprisingly, God agrees to this test, allowing Satan to take away all of Job's blessings without any real reason other than to prove Job's faithfulness. Job chapter 1, verse 6-12. Job's suffering unfolds in brutal waves. First, Job's livestock, which represents his wealth, is stolen by raiders, and his servants are killed. Job chapter 1, verse 14-15. Then, a great wind causes the house where Job's children were gathered to collapse, killing all 10 of his children. Job chapter 1, verse 18-19. Despite these immense losses, Job remains faithful. Satan, however, persuades God to test Job further, afflicting him with painful boils all over his body. Job chapter 2, verse 7. Job is left sitting in ashes, scraping his sores with broken pottery in physical and emotional agony. Job initially remains faithful, famously saying, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job chapter 1, verse 21. However, as the suffering continues and the weight of his losses bears down on him, Job begins to question God. He curses the day he was born, asking why God would allow such suffering for someone who has lived righteously. Job chapter 3, verse 1 to 26. Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, visit him to comfort him. However, their comfort turns into judgment. They argue that Job must have sinned to deserve such suffering, suggesting that God is just and would not allow such things to happen to a righteous person. As described in chapters 4 through 25, Job, in turn, defends his innocence and questions the justice of his suffering. The most disturbing part of the narrative comes when God finally responds to Job's complaints, rather than providing comfort or explaining the reason for Job's suffering. God speaks from a whirlwind, rebuking Job for questioning him. God asks a series of rhetorical questions, emphasizing his power and the mystery of his ways, saying, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" Job chapter 38, verse 4. God's response is essentially, "I am God, and you are not," offering no explanation or justification for Job's suffering. In the end, Job's fortunes are restored. He receives double the wealth he had before, and he has more children. Job chapter 42, verse 10 to 17. The disturbing aspects of the story remain unresolved. Job's first set of children are never brought back, and the divine wager between God and Satan, which caused all this suffering, remains unaddressed. The question of why Job, a righteous man, had to suffer so greatly is left unanswered, except for God's assertion of his absolute power. The story of Job presents a number of theological and ethical contradictions, particularly with the broader biblical themes of God's love, justice, and mercy, as well as Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and the nature of God. 1. God's role in suffering. The most glaring issue is that God initiates the suffering by allowing Satan to test Job. The idea that God would gamble with a human being's life to prove a point seems to contradict the image of a loving and merciful God found elsewhere in the Bible. In the New Testament, God is portrayed as loving and protective, yet here, he allows a faithful servant to suffer immensely for no clear reason other than to prove Job's faith. 2. Lack of justice. God's response to Job is troubling because it offers no clear explanation for Job's suffering. Job is innocent, and yet he suffers as if he is guilty. This seems to contradict the many passages in the Bible where God is described as just and fair. Psalm 11:7 says, "For the Lord is righteous, he loves justice. The upright will see his face." But Job's story suggests otherwise, where the upright suffer without reason. 3. The problem of innocent suffering. Job's story also raises questions about the broader problem of innocent suffering. In the Bible, God is often seen as a protector of the innocent, yet in this case, he allows a blameless man to endure unimaginable pain. This seems inconsistent with Jesus' teachings in the New Testament, where God is described as a loving father who cares deeply for his children. For example, Matthew 6:26 speaks of God caring even for the birds of the air, implying he cares much more for humans. 4. Contradiction with Jesus' teachings. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 7, Jesus teaches about God's mercy, forgiveness, and love. He emphasizes that God is a compassionate father who provides for his children. The story of Job, however, presents a God who allows a faithful servant to suffer without explanation. This portrayal contradicts the God of forgiveness and love that Jesus speaks about, especially in teachings such as, "Love your enemies," Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, and "Forgive as the Father forgives you," Matthew chapter 6, verse 14. Scholars have long debated the book of Job, and many acknowledge the ethical and theological problems it poses. Scholars see Job as a prime example of the problem of theodicy, the question of why a good God allows evil and suffering. Some suggest that the book of Job presents a challenge to simple answers about divine justice, forcing readers to wrestle with the complexity of suffering. However, this leaves unresolved the question of whether God's actions in the story are compatible with his goodness. Many scholars point out that God's refusal to explain Job's suffering is troubling. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and Jewish scholar, found deep discomfort in Job's story, viewing it as a story of divine abandonment. What do you think about this? Share your thoughts with me in the comments before we move on to the next story. The story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar in Genesis 16 is one of the most complex and controversial narratives in the Bible, dealing with issues of power, gender dynamics, and the ethics of surrogacy. At this point in the narrative, Sarah, Sarai, has been unable to bear children for Abram, which is a source of great distress for both of them, as God has promised Abraham that he will be the father of many nations. Desperate to produce an heir, Sarah proposes a solution. She offers her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate, so that Hagar might conceive a child on Sarah's behalf. In the cultural context of the time, this act of surrogacy was not uncommon, but it carries significant ethical implications. Abraham agrees to the plan, and Hagar soon becomes pregnant. However, the situation quickly turns sour. Once Hagar knows she is pregnant, she begins to view herself as superior to Sarah, and this shift in status creates tension between the two women. Sarah reacts with anger and resentment, mistreating Hagar to the point that Hagar flees into the desert. There, an angel of the Lord appears to Hagar, comforting her and instructing her to return to Sarah, promising that her son will become the father of a great nation. Hagar returns and gives birth to Ishmael, who will later become the ancestor of the Arab peoples. Yet this story is far from over, as the arrival of Sarah's son Isaac in the following chapters brings further complications. There are several disturbing elements in this story, many of which deal with the dynamics of power, exploitation, and the mistreatment of Hagar. Sarah's decision to use Hagar as a surrogate reflects the desperate lengths to which she is willing to go to secure an heir. While this was culturally acceptable at the time, it raises serious ethical questions about the exploitation of Hagar's body for the sake of Sarah's personal desires. Hagar, as a servant, has no voice in the matter, and her consent is not considered. This use of her body for childbirth positions her as a tool rather than a person with agency. Abraham's willingness to go along with Sarah's plan without objection is troubling. Although Abraham's faith in God's promise to make him a great nation is clear, his decision to have a child with Hagar instead of waiting for God to fulfill his promise through Sarah reflects a lack of patience and moral leadership. It also highlights his passive role in a situation that ultimately causes harm to all involved. Once Hagar becomes pregnant, her newfound status as the mother of Abraham's heir leads her to look down on Sarah. In response, Sarah mistreats Hagar, subjecting her to harsh treatment. The mistreatment is severe enough to drive Hagar to flee into the wilderness, pregnant and vulnerable. Sarah's actions reflect both jealousy and cruelty, as she abuses her power over Hagar. One of the most disturbing aspects of this story is God's silence on Sarah's treatment of Hagar. Although an angel of the Lord appears to Hagar in the wilderness and comforts her, instructing her to return to Abraham's household, there is no divine rebuke of Sarah's cruelty. Hagar is told to return to her abuser without any clear sense that Sarah's actions will change. The angel's instruction for Hagar to return to Sarah after being mistreated presents another troubling aspect. Hagar's choice to return, albeit under divine instruction, raises questions about the message being sent regarding the acceptance of abusive power dynamics. The promise that Hagar's son will be the father of a great nation seems to justify her return to a situation of vulnerability and subordination. The birth of Isaac in later chapters brings further complications, as Sarah eventually demands that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out into the wilderness. This act of rejection culminates in the ongoing strife between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, symbolizing the long-lasting consequences of decisions made by Abraham and Sarah. The conflict between the two sons is a source of religious and historical division, with Ishmael traditionally viewed as the forefather of the Arab peoples and Isaac as the ancestor of the Israelites. What do you think about this? Share your thoughts with me in the comments before we move on to the next story.